Hi there, and welcome back to the latest installment of Reef's video lectures. Today we're going to be talking about medieval Asia. That is the time period in Ming and Qing China and Tokugawa Japan. I know, hold back your excitement. So we're going to start talking today about the Ming. The Ming Dynasty lasted from 1368 to 1644. And in order to understand what's going on, you have to kind of remember what was going on before the Ming. Remember, prior to this, we had been talking about the Yuan dynasty. The Mongols had been controlling China. And by the time of the Ming, they had gotten sick and tired of the Mongols. They resented this idea of being controlled by people who were essentially foreigners. So this led to revolts. And the revolts led to them driving out the Mongols and a new dynasty being established. Remember, this is the process that is the dynastic cycle. And Hongwu becomes the first of the Ming emperors. Now that the Mongols had been controlling China for a length of time, they tried to eliminate all aspects of that past. They wanted to get rid of anything that reminded them of the Mongolians. They returned to the ideas of Confucianism, of filial piety, of that idea of a superior setting an example for an inferior that had been lost under the Yuan dynasty. They also started to replace that emphasis on education, which led to the return of the civil service system. No longer was it Mongols who were favored to be in the government, and now it was based on your education and your ability. This is also when they moved their capital from Nanjing to Beijing, which is where the current capital is. At the capital in Beijing, they built something called the Forbidden City, and this Forbidden City is still there today. We'll talk more about it in just a minute. Additionally, they sent out the Voyages of Zheng He, or Zheng He in some cases. It's during this time that the Europeans are also starting to explore. So we've got exploration occurring on two different sides of the world. And we'll talk again more about him in just a minute. So let's look first at the Forbidden City. The Forbidden City was built between 1406 and 1420. And really this was a show of power. The Forbidden City, which you can go and visit today, had 35-foot high walls that surrounded this entire sort of mini city. And there were 9,000 rooms that included living quarters, libraries, galleries, audience halls, gardens. There were 6,000 cooks that lived there. And they were responsible for making the meals of the 10 to 15,000 people that were part of the Forbidden City. This was actually the home of the Chinese emperor until 1912. And the only reason that they stopped having the emperor live here in 1912 is because they stopped having emperors. In 1949, when the communists take over, they turn it into a museum. And on one end of the Forbidden City, the one with the picture in the daylight is Tiananmen Square. And there you can see one of their communist leaders that you'll learn more about next year in 10th grade. Now, the Forbidden City during the time of the Ming Dynasty, commoners were not allowed in, only for the purposes of their job. They were not allowed to live there. This was only members of government and members of royalty. Now on to the Voyages of Zheng He. Zheng He led 7 voyages during the time of the Ming Dynasty. A lot of people, when they think of exploration, they don't think of the Chinese. They automatically think of people like Columbus. But during this time period, the voyages led by Zheng He rivaled that of the explorers of the same time period. The purpose of these voyages was to impress the world with the power and the riches of the Ming. Now, Zheng He was actually a Muslim. He was the son of a Mongolian and an Arab. Right there's cultural diffusion for you. And he was drafted into the army and became eventually one of the most respected members of the military under the Emperor of the Ming. As he led these voyages, he went to places throughout the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean where he gave out silver and silk. And when he did this, this is when he started to set up tribute states. And these tribute states would basically, they would give money to the Chinese to not take them over. His fleet was enormous. These ships, which each fleet included ships not just for exploring, but for fighting, storage, and carrying treasure. Each ship was about 400 feet long. And each fleet had crews of upwards of 27,000 people. Just to give you an idea, the big ship in the back is one of the ships of Zheng He. That in the front, that little tiny, it looks like a toy ship, was one of the ships that was brought over during the time of Columbus. So very, very, very big in comparison to that of the European vessels of these times. In 1433, after a number of voyages, for some reason these voyages end. We are unsure as to why they end. Some people say it's because of the competition that was coming in from the Europeans. Some people say it's because of the contact with the Europeans. They were like, I don't want anything to do with these kinds of people. So we're really unsure as to why these voyages ended. At that point, the Ming goes into isolation. They stop trading. They stop interacting with traders through the Silk Road and elsewhere. On to the Qing Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty is in power from 1644 to 1911. It is the last of the Chinese dynasties. The Ming were overthrown by a group known as the Manchus, and the Manchus were from Manchuria. Manchuria is an area in the northeastern part of China. In addition to taking over China, they were also able to take over Burma, Thailand, Laos, Nepal, Vietnam, and Korea. So they really brought the Chinese Empire to its height. But even though they were taking over all these areas, they still wanted to be separate from them. They did not want to absorb into Chinese culture. They didn't want to become Chinese. So for that reason, there were laws against intermarriage and Manchus even wearing Chinese clothing. The one thing that they did keep in China were the ideas of Confucianism. And it's during the Qing Dynasty where you start to see more and more European contact between China and Europe. The Qing allowed for European contact, but they had special rules for the Europeans to follow. One of the things that Europeans could do was only trade at certain ports. So it's not like they could come in and just trade anywhere and everywhere. They were only allowed in certain ports. They also had to pay tribute to the Chinese and perform something called kowtow. Now you have to remember that China for 2,000 years has considered themselves to be the middle kingdom. That is, that they were the center of the world and sort of everything else around them didn't really matter. And this is a mindset that they still have. That they really don't want or need anything that come from the Europeans. Again, Europeans have always been, when you think about, advanced civilization and advanced cultures, Europeans come to mind. But China, for a number of years, had been advanced in comparison to Europe. So the things that the Europeans wanted and the things that they needed to trade with China for, the Chinese didn't want it. They saw them as being barbaric, and what they were trying to trade, they just didn't need. So much of what they do, these restrictions, reflect that. And one of the things that they require them to do is to perform something called a kowtow. And kowtow translates into bowing low. And anytime a European came to China, they were forced to kowtow. That is, to bow their head low and actually hit their head softly on the ground 9 times. This was a show of inferiority. Now, one of the first to come to China were the Dutch, and the Dutch accepted these rules. And because of that, they were able to export things like porcelain, silk, and most importantly, tea. A lot of people, when they think tea, they don't think of the Chinese. They think of the British. But the British did not get a taste for tea until this time period. Speaking of the British refused to accept these rules. They're like, I'm not kowtowing. I'm not accepting these rules. These are backwards people that we need to trade with. We want their stuff. That's it. But they refused to accept these rules. So they try to contact the emperor for a better trade agreement, but they are denied. England wanted China to accept British manufactured goods, And China didn't want any of them. This is starts to see where Britain starts to get more into industrialization and manufacturing, and the Chinese wanted nothing to do with it. We're going to pick up talking about the Qing Dynasty in 10th grade. Now on to the Tokugawa Shogunate. Remember that up until this point, Japan had been using feudalism, with the emperor at the top as a figurehead, the shogun, the daimyo, the samurai as their warriors, peasants, farmers, and merchants below. And in 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu unites Japan under the Tokugawa Shogunate. During this time, it's a time of peace and prosperity. He stopped the fighting that had been going on between the daimyos, the generals, to go on and become shogun. And cities during this time, like Tokyo, start to grow due to the peace and the trade that's going on. So at the same time that the Chinese are being contacted by the Europeans, so are the Japanese. And in 1543, the first contact come between the Europeans and the Japanese. Actually, it's between the Portuguese and the Japanese. And that's because the Portuguese had been shipwrecked on the archipelago, the islands of Japan. At first, they didn't like these weird Europeans coming in, but eventually they start to accept these merchants and these sailors that are coming in. And that's because they had goods that they actually wanted. One of those things were muskets and cannons. They wanted the use of gunpowder. And this is really revolutionary. This changes the way that Japan works, because up through Japanese feudalism, the way of the warrior has been by the sword. But now, with the introduction of guns, the samurai tradition that Japan had is going to change significantly. In 1549, Christian missionaries come in. Remember, missionaries are people that set out to change people's religion. And they were trying to force upon them Christian ideas. And the Japanese were very spiritual, but they tended to be Buddhists, or they followed the ideas of Shinto, very spiritual. They also believe that their emperor is a god. So this idea of Christianity coming in and saying that their emperor is not a god, and there is only one god, the Christian god, this really upset the Japanese. But over a period of about 50 years, about 30,000 Japanese were converted to Christianity. And like I said, the Japanese government does not like this. So in 1612, the Christians are banned from coming in. Once the Christians are banned, the shogun forces the Japanese to practice more traditional forms of religion like Buddhism. And this led to an uprising in 1637 led by Japanese Christian followers. This led to the shogun actually physically persecuting Christians. So the Japanese liked the idea of foreign trade, but they didn't like the foreign ideas that came along with it. So after all of the issues with the Christians, in 1639, they instituted a closed country policy. That barred all Westerners from coming into Japan, but it also prohibited all Japanese from traveling abroad. The only exception was at Nagasaki, and the Dutch and the Japanese were the only two that were allowed to trade there. For the next 200 years, the Japanese would be in isolation. And when you think of the Tokugawa Shogunate, I want you to automatically think isolation. So anytime you hear Tokugawa, think isolation. All right, that's it for today. Thank you.